First of all, thank you very much for having me. I put this presentation together about a year ago. I was requested to put a history of Fantagraphics books together, and what I thought I would do instead, once I started thinking about it, is I preferred to do a history of underground and alternative comics in North America, and weave into that my own personal history with comics. Because I realized that my own obsession about comics, which is a lifelong obsession, is very much a part of the story of Fantagraphics, and Fantagraphics is a part of the story of alternative comics. So I wanted to tell my own story as well as that of Fantagraphics and the history of comics. So I hope there'll be a combination of self-indulgence and education going on here. I grew up reading comics in the 1960s. And when I was growing up reading comics, then most kids my age read comics. But I was much more obsessed with comics than most kids. And these are the kinds of comics I read. They were mostly Marvel and DC comics. They were mostly superhero comics. They were the kinds of comics that most kids my age read. But like I said, I was far more obsessed with them than most. And I started publishing a fan magazine when I was 13 years old. There's what was called fandom, which was a loose coalition across the United States of fans, all of whom were either bought or published fanzines or who went to comic book conventions. This was the fanzine I published when I was 13. That would have been 1967. And it was a really amateurish fanzine that I put together at home that my father took to his office and Xeroxed for me. We probably printed about 50 issues of it, 50 copies of it, and then we sold it to other like-minded fans. One of the highlights of that period of my youth was going to comic book conventions. And they started holding conventions in the mid-1960s. This is a great photograph from the 1969 New York Comic Book Convention. A lot of professionals went there. This is a photograph of the awards banquet, and they were giving an award to Hal Foster, who created and drew Prince Valiant for about 40 years. Hal Foster, I'm sorry you can't see this a little bit more vividly, but Hal Foster is, of course, where the red arrow is. And I am actually front and center right there. This is 69, so I guess I was 15. And the only reason I was front and center is because my table was off to the right and couldn't be seen by the camera, so they had all of us move to the very front of the row. Anyway, this is a great photograph, the least reason because I'm there, but there were just dozens and dozens of working professionals who drew Marvel and DC comics at this thing. So it's kind of an historic photo. Boy publisher, age around 15 or 16. For those of you under the age of 50, that's a typewriter in front of me, a comic collection behind me, and I'm busy putting out a fanzine. These were covers of two fan magazines I published when I was a little bit older, about 17 years old, I guess, and you can see that I was getting a little bit more sophisticated in terms of design. And I gradually, over the course of 4 or 5 years, did start getting more sophisticated about the comics I read. And in 1971, I actually put on a comic book convention, not too dissimilar to this one. That was in Washington, D.C. I put on a convention in 1971 and 1972. I was still in high school. This is an article in the Washington Sun-Times about the convention then. And one of our guests of honor at the convention was a very well-known fantasy illustrator, cartoonist by the name of Frank Frazetta. Frazetta was an extraordinary artist. Quite a brilliant painter and cartoonist then, who had stopped doing comics and started doing paintings. This is one of his paintings for a Conan paperback, which was very popular then. And I included this photo, which I found. It's me giving an award to Frank Frazetta, and I included it simply because I thought it was just so ridiculous for me to give Frank Frazetta an award. You know, he needed an award from me like he needed a lesson in painting. But I invited him down there, and for some reason, he actually agreed to pack up a lot of his paintings in his car, and he actually drove from Pennsylvania to Washington, which is about 250 miles. He was incredibly gracious. He set up an exhibit for us. It's one of the few exhibits that he showed back then. I have no idea why he did it, but he was an incredibly gracious guy. So the underground comics movement started in the mid to late 1960s. And I more or less missed those. I was a late bloomer. I discovered underground comics in the early 70s. I was just a little bit too young and a little bit too sheltered to have read underground comics when they came out in their heyday in the 60s. So around 1972 or so, I discovered underground comics. Now I think underground comics, in retrospect, was one of the most important movements in the history of comics. It was the first time that cartoonists actually understood themselves to be artists and exerted that role in the medium. That previously, of course, is an illustration by R. Crumb. There was a magazine published in the mid to late 60s that was published by Wally Wood, who was a mainstream cartoonist, but who wanted to break out of the chains of mainstream cartooning and do something on his own. He published a magazine called Wit's End. There were alternative newspapers being published at the time, of which this is one, the East Village Other, New York, another cover by Robert Crumb. Anyway, there were a vast number of underground comics being published, and I discovered those in the early 70s, when in my last year of high school, my first year of college. And reading them was a real revelation to me, because I realized at that point that comics would be something far more than I'd originally been exposed to. This, of course, is a very famous cover of Zero, which didn't precede #1, but I think followed #1 by some months. But a brilliantly iconic drawing by Mr. Crumb. And there were artists like Justin Green, who pioneered autobiographical comics with his Binky Brown, The Virgin Mary, published in the 60s. There were a number of women cartoonists, of whom Trina Robbins was one. This is about 1967. And then extraordinary work by Gilbert Shelton. The one thing about underground comics is that every single one of the best underground cartoonists were unique artists, unique stylists. They didn't follow a house style like the mainstream publishers did, and I recognized that pretty early on. So I was bouncing from one college to another in the early 1970s, and I realized at some point that I was pretty much unfit to be employed by anybody else. And so I tried to figure out how I could be self-employed, how I could work for myself, and do something that I could take some responsibility for and have some respect for. And I wanted to start a publishing company because I knew a lot about how to put magazines together, and publishing was something I just wanted to do. So I figured I needed money to do it, and I had no money. So since I put on a comics convention, I thought the best way to make money would be to use that skill that I learned putting on a comics convention and put on a convention that could make a lot of money. So I thought of putting on a rock and roll convention because rock and roll was a lot more popular than comics. So my idea was to put on a rock and roll convention to make a huge amount of money and then to put that money into a publishing company. So with that idea, my then partner, Mike Catron, and I, who was a comics buddy, devised this scheme to put on a Rock and Roll Expo in 1975. And what we did was we imitated comics conventions. So we tried to get professional rock critics, journalists. We tried to get bands. We actually tried to get rock stars to come and talk to it, none of which worked. the biggest celebrity that I managed to get to come to the convention was Hunter S. Thompson, who is a famous journalist, and he had a penchant for two things. One was telling the truth about the political process, and the second was taking vast quantities of drugs. Eventually, he turned out to be much more successful at the latter, but he was an incredible journalist in the 1960s and into, I think, the mid-1970s, and he appeared at the convention. Now, the only good thing about the convention was that I was able to spend a day with Hunter Thompson, chauffeuring him around Washington, D.C., and just hanging out with him. Otherwise, the rock and roll convention was a complete and utter failure. I lost more money at that convention than I had ever seen in my life, which meant that I lost money that I borrowed from other people. So then I had to figure out what to do with my life, and I got a real job. I had to pay back, I still remember the exact figure, it was $14,500. And at that point in my life, it might as well have been $14 million because I'd never seen that kind of money before in my life. So I had to work for a year, my partner worked for a year, and all we did was spend that year paying back the money. But we had a big mailing list from the convention, and I still wanted to publish. I still love putting together an editorial package and actually literally putting it together on a drawing board, typing it, pasting it up, doing all the things you had to do before computers came in. And so a friend of mine bankrolled a rock and roll fan magazine in the hopes that it would make money. Now, I really didn't care that much about rock and roll. This was a purely opportunistic, the convention was purely opportunistic. I just wanted to make money to bankroll a publishing company. But I wanted to put out a magazine so badly that we agreed to put out this rock and roll magazine. This lasted for a couple of years, and as usual, didn't make any money. And so I wanted to get back into doing something that I believed in, that I cared about, because I figured that's the only way I could be successful. What my partner and I decided to do was to start a magazine about comics. I had actually attended 3 years of college, never graduating, but I studied journalism and I studied criticism and I studied literature, and I actually got something of an education. And so my thought was to impose this newfound education on my first love of comics. And so what we did was we started a magazine, or we took over a magazine called the Nostalgia Journal, which was an existing magazine that we wanted to breathe new life into and that we wanted to change the direction of. Now, we started publishing the Comics Journal in 1976, and coincidentally enough, it was the same exact month that Arcade Comics published their last issue. And I think what's interesting about that is that I think Arcade was really sort of the last hurrah of underground comics. After that, underground comics became pretty moribund due to a whole bunch of social reasons, including the shutting down of head shops, the shutting down of the distribution centers of underground comics. And it was at that moment when we decided to publish a critical magazine about comics. It was probably the worst time we could do that because mainstream comics were absolutely, had hit a nadir, had hit a creative nadir. This is the kind of crap that was being published in mainstream comics at the time. And so we created the magazine as a kind of discontented magazine that essentially and mostly criticized what was being published at the time. We wanted to write real journalism about what was going on in the industry. We wanted to impose critical standards on comics. And what that meant at the time was basically just writing really harsh reviews of comics that were being published then, and championing the few independently published and underground comics that were still coming out at the time. We were so idealistic at the time that we even created this Declaration of Principles, which I think I probably stole from Citizen Kane. We wanted this to set us apart from all the other fan magazines that were published at the time, all of which were essentially kind of gushing, obsequious magazines that thought that everything Marvel and DC did was tremendously important. So we published a lot of muckraking articles. We championed creators' rights. We championed what we consider to be artistic standards in comics. This was an interview with Will Eisner, who at the time represented a certain artistic standard in comics. And if I can read that, the quote on top kind of represented our editorial point of view. We were really trying to push comics as an art form. And Will Eisner said, if I can read it, "I believe that sequential art is the oldest communicating medium." I can't really read that, and you can't either, I think, but it was a really idealistic expression of what comics were capable of at the time, and that meant a lot to us. And so we wanted to interview people like Will Eisner, and we were publishing articles where we were championing people like Jack Kirby, who at the time was involved in a huge controversy with Marvel Comics, where Marvel Comics essentially stole all of his artwork, something like 6,000 pages of his art, and wouldn't return it until he signed a retroactive work-for-hire contract where he agreed that everything he did for the company was owned by the company. So we spent something like 2 years championing Jack Kirby. We would interview people like Art Spiegelman, who was then publishing Raw, and who we thought was doing ambitious work, that ought to be championed. Now, at the same time, there was a very burgeoning, small, independent publishing movement coming up that I guess I would characterize as post-underground, and mostly it was stuff that was published by mainstream, or it was published including mainstream creators, doing essentially the same thing they did in mainstream comics, but with more sex and violence. This is one example. And these two are examples of self-published comics that came out in the late 1970s. And Harvey Pekar published his own comic in the 1970s. And again, someone like Pekar we thought was bringing a vitality to the comics medium by doing autobiographical stories of, about his own life. And so there was this slowly burgeoning independent publishing movement that started in the late 70s and early 80s. And in 1981, we'd been publishing the Comics Journal from 1976 on. In 1981, we published a graphic novel by Jack Jackson. He was one of my favorite underground cartoonists. Started out doing satirical work, and then he started doing historical work. And he actually became a really first-rate historian as well as a first-rate cartoonist. He started doing serious historical work in comics form. He had done one graphic novel before this, and I befriended him, I think, because we interviewed him in the Comics Journal, and then he came to me and he said he had this book that he wanted to do, and he asked us if we could bankroll it. I literally think we had to send him something like $25 a month for about a year and a half, so he could live his Spartan existence and do this comic, and that's about all we could afford at the time. But we managed to do it, and it was exactly the kind of comics that we wanted to see published. Although we didn't see ourselves as a comics publisher, we just sort of fell into it, and we published this in 1981. And in 1981, two very influential anthology magazines started, representing two different kinds of aesthetic spheres, I think, in comics. One was Weirdo on the right, edited by Robert Crumb. On the left is Raw, edited by Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly. These were incredibly important and influential magazines at the time. They were publishing not only great underground cartoonists, but they were also championing new work, European work, outsider art, and things like that. And in 1982, we published what I consider our flagship comic, which is Love and Rockets by the Hernandez brothers. The Hernandez brothers just sort of appeared out of nowhere. They were about 18, 19, 20 years old at the time. They self-published their own comic. They sent it to the Comics Journal for review, and I got it. And I was so impressed by it that I had to write a review of it in the magazine. And then, I forget for what reason, but anyway, I contacted them, asked them if they'd be interested in having us publish it because we essentially had the distribution infrastructure in place. And they said, sure. And so we republished their first issue. We expanded the size of it to 64 pages and started publishing it as a quarterly magazine. This is an example of Jaime Hernandez and Gilbert Hernandez's work. You know, they brought such a fresh point of view to comics, such a kind of naturalistic point of view about human life. Sexuality was simply a part of life in their comics. You know, they dwelled on how people live their lives, and that was something of a revelation to me. It was the kind of thing that I'd always I had imagined the comics ought to be, but that there were no real examples of there having been those kinds of comics. And when I saw the Hernandez brothers' work, it was that kind of revelation, that this is what we had been hoping for a number of years. And then we started publishing classic newspaper strips. So in 1982, 1983, we started publishing Popeye, which was one of my favorite strips. We started publishing Prince Valiant by Hal Foster. And then we also started publishing a magazine devoted exclusively to newspaper strips called Nemo, which was edited by Rick Marshall, who's one of the great comic strip historians in the country. This ran 31 issues over the course of about 8 years. And I think it's a repository of some of the greatest newspaper strips ever published, as well as scholarly articles that accompanied them. So this is the kind of direction that we wanted to go in. Now, one of the reasons we were even able to do this is because of low overhead. We lived and worked out of a house in Stamford, Connecticut. 5 of us lived in this house and worked in the house. The bottom of the house was our office. The 2 top floors were where we lived. And you know, we were able to basically sort of amortize all the overhead by renting this gigantic house. It was in this Stamford, Connecticut is a bedroom community of New York City. It's about a 45-minute train ride out. We couldn't afford New York City or any of the boroughs there, but we could afford Connecticut. And it was a really incredibly rich neighborhood. And I think I was able to rent the house because the owner of the house lived in Puerto Rico and actually didn't see who was renting the house. We were surrounded by lawyers and doctors and TV network executives who had no clue as to what we were doing there. Now, we published a lot. I mean, we broke from the tradition of fanzine publishing in the Comics Journal by publishing a lot of really harsh pieces about what was going on in the industry. And we were sued 3 times within a course of 2 years, 1979, 1980, 1981. One lawsuit involved a writer who sued us over an interview where a science fiction author by the name of Harlan Ellison called him crazy. Another publisher sued us because I wrote an editorial that accused him of being guilty of perpetuating spiritual squalor, which my lawyers said is going to be very difficult to actually prove in court. And we were finally sued by an artist who we called a plagiarist in 36-point type. So we were simultaneously being sued for a total of, I think, $5 million. And I think I was 24 or 25 at the time. I'd never had any contact with lawyers. I didn't know what to do. And so I had to learn how to navigate this process. And I finally found a fantastic lawyer who was committed to First Amendment issues. And he agreed to take this on. And eventually we won all 3 of these lawsuits. One of them lasted for 7 years and ended up in a 4-week jury trial in New York City.